Okay, so this morning we have a session that's going to be great for kicking off the morning because we're going to talk about what I feel is a very large systemic issue facing the entire defense industrial base in terms of how people approach and understand their CMMC readiness, their scoring against NIST 800-171, the context of how you interact with consultants and service providers, software vendors, basically anybody that you as an organization seeking certification, you as an organization that has to deal with folks internally to understand what's going on, whether you yourself are a vendor or whether you yourself have clients, consistently over the last 2 or 3 years now, having dealt with 200 or so small companies in terms of the context of NIST 171 and CMMC, there's been a consistent pattern that has shown up where with all of the different clauses, with all of the different rules, with all of the different standards, with all the different renaming, the lines have gotten very blurry, and a lot of the language that's used to describe things gets reused, but it means different things to different organizations. And so in the context of all that confusion, what ends up happening is people start to score themselves, they start to do gap assessments, they start to pay for services or software with the understanding that maybe they are more ready than they actually are. So in my opinion, before we get started, the last 2 years or so, when we've been talking about CMMC, a lot of what has been happening is awareness, right? We were like, CMMC is a thing. NIST 800-171 is a thing. DFARS clauses are things that you need to pay attention to. There's some sort of relationship between them. But as we've seen, the threat landscape is only getting crazier. There's a lot of debate about when things are going to happen, what they're going to look like when they happen, but clearly the winds are blowing in a certain direction where something having to do with this world of controls within a business environment is going to be a factor that people have to consider moving forward. And so as a result, when you take all of these elements into play and then you start to ask sort of basic questions about how they interface with one another or what they mean, you start to get some very sort of interesting results. So about 3 weeks ago, I put this poll on LinkedIn, and it's a relatively simple question, but the results were very mixed. And so I believe everybody at home is still able to see everything in terms of the display, but according to the DFARS interim rule, so at the time of this talk, of this recording, whenever you end up watching, how long should it take for you to do a basic self-assessment, calculate the score that represents that assessment, and then upload it into what's known as SPRS, Supplier Performance Risk System? It happens. Okay, so does anybody know the answer? According to the interim rule? It's okay. No, I know no one reads the rules, so if you don't know, it's fine. This is perfectly fine. Anybody? So the answer actually is 45 minutes. To conduct a basic self-assessment, calculate the score, and upload it is actually 45 minutes. The trick here is that technically the self-assessment, the basic self-assessment, is only supposed to take you 30 minutes, according to the government's estimates. 15 minutes of your time is supposed to be spent calculating the score and then interacting with the government's website, which I think is hilarious that by their own estimation, a third of your time is spent dealing with their website, right? So they know. But we clearly have a problem here because 60% of the people who interacted with this poll, and there was a relatively large number of people who interacted with it, said something other than 45 minutes. And we're going to get into the details of why a basic self-assessment means something very specific and why the estimate of 45 minutes actually makes a lot of sense in a few moments. But the point is that there's disagreement within the community about what these terms mean, how long things should take, or what even the official sort of book answer is, even if we think that the book answer would happen to be wrong. Okay, so in order to get through all of the ideas here, the goal at the end of the session is to be able to take anybody based off whatever your position is in the ecosystem around CMMC, DFARS, NIST controls, and allow you to have more confidence in your ability to interact with your teams inside, to interact with service providers, consultants, vendors, government officials, whoever you need to have a conversation with about this material. It requires that you have a better and more detailed understanding of what the terms mean, why sometimes they get reused, where they came from, what their intentions were. So in order to do that, we're going to have to step through the interim rule for a few moments. I promise no more timelines if you saw the talk from May, so we're not going to make you sit through more timelines. But we're going to sort of dissect the interim rule and explain what the various elements are, explain what the clauses are, explain how they relate and where the requirements come from, so we have one single map that we can all work off of. Then we need to talk about the DoD assessment methodology. And this is the primary culprit behind a lot of the confusion, because the term basic assessment in the DoD assessment methodology does not mean what you think it means. And so as a result, the idea that it would take 45 minutes makes sense in DoD assessment la-la land. In terms of actual assessment timeframes, it's very, very different. So the problem that comes up, and we'll see as we go through here, is that once you start to explain these concepts, we quickly discover that the unknown unknowns with regards to control frameworks, NIST controls, and how they work in terms of the requirements that get passed on to companies is much larger than people know. There is a other half of NIST 800-171 that, in my opinion, is the most critical part of understanding what success looks like under a self-assessment, an internal assessment, an external assessment, whoever is doing your assessment against controls. It's the unknown other half of the model that's the most important. That implies that we need to go deeper into what a security control means. So we're going to dissect that and go into the anatomy of one, and then the takeaways will become apparent once we start to dive into it. Okay. So the interim rule, like I said, it's okay if nobody's read it, because we're going to step through it here in just a few moments. All right, so the current interim rule as of the time of this talk is what is formerly known as DFARS case 2019 D041. So if you Google that string of characters, then you will be taken to the Federal Register, where there is a very long document that is explaining the DoD's rationale, the government's rationale regarding a few things. Fundamentally, the interim rule does three things. It makes three clauses, and these are terms that you may have heard. It creates the 7019 clause, the 7020 clause, and the 7021 clause. Now, at their most basic level, everything in the Federal Register that regards this rule and everything within those DFARS clauses is fundamentally describing some form of assessment of the same set of requirements. So if you look at the 7019 clause, this is the one that says you need to conduct a basic self-assessment, a basic contractor self-assessment. The 7021 clause says you have to make yourself available in case the DoD wants to show up and they want to conduct their version of the assessment of the same requirements. There's two of them. There's the medium assessment, there's the high assessment. We're going to explain what that means. The 7021 clause is the sort of boogeyman out there, because that's the one that says you need a CMMC certification. But fundamentally, CMMC certification is just an assessment of the controls, and really it's an assessment of the same set of controls. So the 7019 and 7021 clauses prescribe these three forms of assessment, and all three forms of those assessments are governed and described by what's known as the DoD assessment methodology. Now, they didn't even make a cover page for this. This is the actual cover page of the document. If you look at it, it's just a table of contents. They didn't put their seal on it. I mean, I don't know. So the DoD assessment methodology lays out these three forms of assessment, these three tiers of assessment, and they all relate to the requirements in NIST 800-171. So you can start to see the map coming together here. There's one interim rule that prescribes three clauses. All of the clauses prescribe some form of assessment. Three of those assessments are described in one document. CMMC and the three assessments in the DoD assessment methodology all map to NIST 800-171. Now, this is a longer conversation, but even CMMC itself, in its own special, very special CMMC-esque way, has a roundabout way of mapping to those same controls. This is probably a talk that we need to go into more detail for, but just if you don't know yet, just trust me. Okay, so where does 800-171 come from? Because the elephant in the room right now, if you're familiar, is what happened to DFARS 7012. DFARS 7012 is the one everybody talks about. These other three are not DFARS 7012. So if you go back to the timeline talk that happened in May, which several people have seen, it will tell you in excruciating detail how A decade ago, we started the rulemaking process that eventually got us to what we know now as DFARS 7012. So separate rulemaking events, separate clauses. The DFARS 7012 clause, as we know it right now, is a result of this DFARS case up here, 2013 D018. If you Google either one of those, it'll take you right to the Federal Register. You go down the same rabbit holes that I went down. I don't recommend it, just watch the video. Okay, so very simply, and so just real quick, the 2013 clause here that creates 7012, it creates other things, but for our purposes here, we're whittling those down. The only one that really matters in our context is the 7012 clause. Now, what the 7012 clause does is it has 13 paragraphs in it. That's it. It's only 13 paragraphs long. And only a few of those actually impose obligations on the contractor. A lot of those paragraphs impose obligations on the government. The most important one is paragraph B. Paragraph B says that at a minimum, you have to implement all of the 110 controls in 800-171 in order to establish what the government calls adequate security. Now they say that's the minimum, so of course we're all going to spend more time and money and effort doing other things, but at a minimum, the minimum is 800-171. So this is the overall relationship between the various clauses, the requirements, and the various assessments that are going to happen, and this is how they all connect. Now this is a very important concept to remember, that DFARS 7012 points to a different document. It points to a different standard, because what we're going to see is that the Dod Assessment Methodology also points to other standards. So when they use phrases like an assessment, if they point to a different assessment framework, then it might mean something different than what you were imagining. Within 800-171, the key control that we want to focus on and remember today is that there is a requirement to periodically assess yourself. Here we go again, right? Assess yourself with the implementation of these 110 controls within your environment. Periodically, make sure you assess them to test their effectiveness, make sure they're implemented. So let's remember that you have the 3 clauses from the current interim rule. You have 4 forms of assessment, although we're not going to really talk about CMMC in any detail. Then you have a different rule, which is currently the final rule we all live under, that points to 171, which itself has a requirement to assess yourself. Okay, so if we sort of move those all over to the side of the screen here, we've got the DFARS 7012 clause, its requirement for periodic assessment, and that is contained within 800-171. We've got the 3 clauses from the current interim rule and their forms of assessment, which we know point to the same set of requirements. So within 800-171, just as a quick review, it is 110 controls that are divided across what are known as 14 families, right? This is the very sort of basic cut down version of a document known as 853, which is sort of the big granddaddy catalog of security controls used on federal systems. This is the distilled version that's applied to non-federal systems. How we got there is a longer story. Watch the video from May. So the Dod Assessment Methodology is fundamentally a scoring system for those controls, right? If you have gone through and you've implemented those controls, then what the Dod Assessment Methodology says is that we're going to take all 110 and we're going to divide it into 3 different buckets and assign them points. How they assign those points is a hilarious story that we'll talk about when we're all drinking later. So they take these 110 requirements and they split them up. So there's 44 controls that are worth 5 points, there's 14 that are worth 3 points, and there's 52 that are worth a single point. So you can do the math quickly in your head. You can imagine if you don't have the 5-point controls properly implemented, your score is going to go down very quickly. So the points are subtracted based off what is not implemented. So if you start out with the assumption that you have already been doing these requirements, which is everybody's favorite thing that the government tells us, that you've already been doing this for years because the 7012 clause that points to the requirements has been in place for so long, then according to the government, I mean, even the way they structured the scoring approach is built off the assumption that more things are implemented than not implemented. You don't start from a point of not having things implemented and then count up. You start from the assumption that everything is in place and then maybe take a few things off based off what is not implemented. But when you start and you look at the math and how this is added up, You get 110 if you have everything implemented perfectly. And then you subtract the corresponding number of points from 110. So if you have nothing implemented, you get a negative 204. It's its own fun way of how they created that. Like I said, longer story about how we got there. But the idea is that if the controls are not implemented, then you remove the points. So when we think about, how the process of going through this assessment is going to work, when we look at what the different clauses are asking, we can see that there are similarities and differences between the approaches. So for 7012, we have the internal assessment requirement that we're going to do periodically. For the basic, medium, and high assessments, we have in the DoD assessment methodology, the basic one is something that we do, a basic self-assessment, which was from the LinkedIn poll, whereas the 7020 clause says the government's personnel are going to be doing a medium or a high assessment. For CMMC down here, right, we don't know, so it's just it's a shruggy face. We don't really know who's doing the assessments yet. They're just here for posterity. If they get updated between now and the time we post the slides, then we'll make sure we fill in the colors. But they're just there so that you remember that within the context of what's going on, CMMC is a thing, but the requirements that we're talking about still exist by themselves. The assessment process for those requirements still exists regardless of what's happening with the status of the CMMC program. Okay, so when we look at what happens, there's no requirement in 7012 to upload your score to SPRS. That is a requirement that is specified by the clauses that are specified by the interim rule. And then when we talk about what is assessed, that is something that is specifically described within this DoD assessment methodology. So the basic and the medium are assessments of your SSP. So when they say the phrase, a basic self-assessment, they are not talking about the same thing as a periodic assessment in DFARS 7012. Your 3.12.1 is the control, your internal self-assessment. This is a review of an SSP document, not a review of the control environment. So they use the word assessment, but they don't actually mean the same thing. And then they get to the estimated time, which we all thought was hilarious because they say it should only take you 30 minutes. Now, if the government personnel are going to do it, then it's going to take 3 hours. And now we're going to start to see a pattern of wildly different time estimates based off of things that sound the same. So if you go on to the NIST 171 webpage, there is a link there to a template for an SSP. It is not very good, but it's the one that's on the website, so that's the one we're going to use for reference. So on this very basic template for the NIST version of how an SSP is outlined, right? There's basically a control, the control item that you're talking about, and then 3 choices. It's implemented, it's not implemented, it's not applicable, and then just a blurb that says, tell us about it. How did you do this? Not very helpful if you don't know what to do, right? So when we have a basic self-assessment of the SSP and we have a medium assessment of the SSP, how did we get from 30 minutes to 3 hours if 2 people are looking at the same document? The reason why it goes so much faster is that according to the DoD assessment methodology, when you look at your SSP, the only part that you need to go through and look at is whether things are implemented or not. Remember, you're only taking points away from the assumption that everything is implemented if they are not actually in place. So if your SSP is done, which they assumed that it was done, and you've gone through and you've marked everything as implemented because you've been doing this all along, then you're only looking at the checkboxes. There would be a handful of things that are not implemented. You'd go to the back of the DoD assessment methodology, be like 5 points, 3 points, 1 point, subtract from 110, bam, you've calculated your score, and now you get to spend the next 20 minutes trying to get logged in to SPRS. So if those assumptions are true, then 30 minutes to flip through 110 checkboxes doesn't really take very long because you're not evaluating the controls. You're not assessing the control environment. You're reading a checklist of checkboxes that the assumption says you've already done your NIST 800-171 internal assessment. Your SSP is a reflection of your determinations about whether those controls are in place. So you can see how the term assessment under basic self-assessment means something wildly different than when people read the poll on LinkedIn and they go, there's no way it would, you couldn't even get through a control. in 45 minutes for most people. Because when we hear that there is a self-assessment, we think you're assessing the control environment. So when we get over to the medium assessment, the DoD assessment methodology says, we're not going to have one of our DIBCAC assessors or one of our government personnel show up and then look through the checklist the way that you look through the checklist, because we're not you. And so we didn't do the control assessment. What we want to see is your description of how things are implemented. How did you do it? And how do you know if something is implemented? Now, they're not going to walk through and like ask you to show them. They're not going to show up and do what we'll see as the high version of the assessment, the more intense version, but they're going to read through the SSP with more of a fine-tooth comb to say, does this make sense? Are they just making it up? Is there anything written in the SSP at all under the box that says it's implemented? Because if there's nothing there, how would you have any confidence at all other than it just being this basic self-attestation contractor self-assessment thing? So this is why they have this tier of difference. Okay, so we understand how they got to 30 minutes. We understand how they got to 3 hours, because what an assessment is looking at is different depending on what it is that we're being asked to assess. Assess an SSP doesn't take very long. However, if we get asked to assess an entire system, right, the system that is represented by your system security plan, then our time estimates are way different. According to the interim rule, the process not for preparation, the process not for post-assessment activity, the process just for sitting down with an assessor from the government to walk through your controls is going to take 232 times longer than the process for them to read your SSP. Now you might notice a problem here, right? Everybody always says, oh, how long should it take me to get 171 implemented? How much is it going to cost? What is it going to take? What's the level of effort? They've never estimated how long it would take you to do 800 171. They didn't even estimate how long it would take you to do the self-assessment that's required within 800 171, but they are the same, because instead of looking at the SSP, they're looking at the entire control environment. So we can extrapolate and say that 116 hours for somebody to come in and do an assessment against your entire system, it is the same assessment scope, it is the same assessment process for you to satisfy the requirements in 800 171, so it should be pretty similar. It took you 30 minutes in order to do your SSP, and it takes them 116 hours to do your assessment. Then when you do what they do, it should also take you maybe not 116 hours, but significantly longer. Intuitively, this makes sense. I mean, this is exactly what the LinkedIn poll was showing, right? When you ask people, how long does it take you to do an assessment? And you say 45 minutes, they go, no, no, no. It's gonna take much, much longer. So we're still consistent here. The government is saying, yes, you're right. If I ask you to do something other than what the DoD assessment methodology calls a basic assessment, it will take significantly longer. Okay, I promised we weren't going to talk about CMMC, but this is hilarious. So if you look at the estimates in the interim rule for how long it takes to do an assessment under CMMC, it says 96 hours. There are more controls in CMMC than there are in 800 171. Anybody? I don't know. I don't know how they did that, right? But either way, if the estimates are clearly the estimates are not scientifically precise, right? They're not the exact amount of time that it would take. The magnitude of difference is the important concept to remember here. So what is it that would be causing this massive delta in time? Reading an SSP doesn't take very long. Doing an assessment does take very long. What is it that they are doing in the assessment that would take 200 times longer? Does anybody know? Right? It's what you do the assessment in accordance with. It is the process that you walk through to actually conduct an assessment. And the process that you walk through to actually conduct the assessment is documented in a document called NIST SP 800 171A. This is the other half of the model that we were talking about earlier. The reason why it takes you 232 times longer by estimate to do your assessment is because you have real things that you need to be doing in order to be walking through an assessment. So clearly this is a big problem, because most people don't know that 800-171A exists. They know that their assessment should be taking longer, but as we're going to see, in the government's eyes, the only way for you to officially do an assessment of these controls, and the only way for you to actually determine whether the controls are implemented, which is the only way that you'd be able to score the points under DoD assessment methodology and uploading your score, is if you walk through that process. If you didn't know that that process existed, or if you paid somebody who didn't know that that process existed, and they did your assessment, and they didn't go through this process, then what you paid them for, or what you spent your time doing, probably isn't right. Okay, so always fun to tell people that 800-171A exists, because they usually don't know that 800-171A exists. I mean, we had to draw a map to explain how the clauses and the documents and the requirements all map out. 171A, not prescribed anywhere on that map, because it isn't necessarily the thing that you need to understand how everything interfaces together. However, on the NIST webpage for 800-171, right down here, it says the other part of this publication, NIST 800-171A. So why are there two documents? Why on earth are there two documents that are barely referenced within each other? If you do Control F for 171A inside 171, how could there possibly be two? This is a bad design decision by NIST in order to have two different documents. It is not user-friendly, right? If you go, like I said, watch the timeline video, we outline in excruciating detail the terrible assumptions that were made by the government about what is going on in the DIB, about relative security maturity, about what you understand about system security engineering, all kinds of stuff. The idea that you would know that there's a secondary document, even though it's linked on the web page, is just not something that users do. Anybody that's done user interface design would know this. You have to make it as easy as possible. So, sorry, go back one second. So the reason that there are two documents for 171 is we know that 171 is derived from 853. It is the cut down, distilled version of federal controls for non-federal systems. There is an assessment guide for those federal controls. Therefore, there is a corresponding assessment guide for the cut down non-federal systems. Now, the reason why there's two 853 documents is a function of the NIST RMF process, the Risk Management Framework process. So the 853 catalog of controls is this gigantic document of controls that is sort of the large hard copy database of the controls that they pick from to apply to weapon systems and information systems, whatever it is that the government happens to be making. So they go through this multi-step process of the RMF, and the documents that correspond to each step are distinct. So the select controls step of the RMF process for the government requires a large document that contains controls. You're not assessing controls, so you don't need an assessment guide. You don't need a document full of assessment procedures until you get to a different step, right? This is the bureaucracy part that everybody loves. Makes total sense from a sequential cycle of how we're going to do security for federal systems, but it created two different documents. If you continue down that path and we start breaking those documents down and then handing them to people who are not familiar with this process, you will not know that there is another document, that there is an assess step, right? So this makes sense how we got to two different forms of 171, but the RMF doesn't apply to us. We don't do the risk management framework in the industrial base and non-federal systems. So why do we still have two, right? This will be a suggestion after the end of the talk. Whenever we're planning on capturing a lot of this information into a white paper, we'll have the slides up. But also in terms of our formal feedback to NIST, please stop doing this. Having two separate documents helps no one. What's really ironic, and I don't have a picture of it up here, is if you look at some of the new documentation, some of the new control frameworks that NIST is developing in the wake of the executive order, in the wake of presidential memoranda, things like that, they don't do this. They don't issue two separate documents for those sets of requirements, but because it was so tightly coupled with the 853 documents, we got stuck with different ones. Okay, so we know that the idea of assessment is very different, and now all of a sudden we have this mystery set of assessment procedures, the details of which we're going to get to shortly. But it's important to sort of see how they work sequentially. The easiest way to do that is to look at the purpose statements of the documents. I promise I won't read too many of these paragraphs from NIST documentation to you. Okay, so 801.71. The purpose is to give you the security requirements for protecting the confidentiality of CUI, non-federal systems. This is the part we're all familiar with. 801.71a. These are the procedures, the assessment procedures for the requirements in 801.71. So then what is the DoD assessment methodology? According to the DoD assessment methodology, this is a strategic assessment of a contractor's implementation of the controls. What does that mean, right? This is a different idea of what the word assessment means from what the assessment guide for the requirements is saying. So if you operated without the middle piece here, then you are not going to get an accurate picture of what's going on, either in terms of your current control environment, your overall compliance score, or your readiness for new frameworks and programs like CMMC that would be coming your way to have somebody else do the verification. Okay, just a couple more examples of why it's very important to pay attention to 801.71a. For those of you that are familiar with 171a, it's self-apparent, but there is some amplifying information that the government has provided in far off corners of their guidance. It starts to paint a pretty clear picture. So the Dod Procurement Toolbox is a .com website that is actually run by the government. It's run under the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, under the acquisition side, under defense pricing and contracting, and down and down and down. Eventually you get to this database of frequently asked questions. It's a great resource. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend you do. Hitting Control F for whatever your heart desires in the context of controls and CMMC and things like that, you will have endless fun finding weird answers in the frequently asked questions from the government. If you didn't want to go into the Federal Register and sort of read their explanations for how they get to various conclusions, then the frequently asked question is maybe like the faster version of the same effect. So FAQ number 121 describes what the CMMC or the DoD assessment methodology does, and it says it wasn't developed in order to be a set of assessment procedures. This wasn't developed for you to know if your controls are implemented. This was developed to complement 171A. I mean, they created it with the idea that 171A is a fundamental part of what you're doing in terms of assessing your controls. So when we go back and we look at 171 in terms of the breakdown of the controls and families, and then the breakdown by the DoD assessment methodology into point categories, tiers of points, and how we subtract points for things that are not being implemented, if you didn't pass through the procedures in 171A, then you are missing the information to calculate that score correctly. Okay, and then one of the last pieces here. So NARA is the executive agent for the CUI program government-wide, right? They are the ones that are in charge of the overall program. They're the ones that wrote the 32 CFR that governs the CUI program for everyone, all the safeguarding requirements. ISU is the office within NARA, the agency, that runs the CUI program. This is where, all of the blog posts and the CUI stakeholder calls, this is the office that it's run out of. And they release official guidance from time to time in these CUI notices. They used to come out more often, but they've sort of slowed down a little bit. Anyways, the 2020-04 one is very interesting because they even specifically say that 171 is the set of procedures for assessing the requirements, and it is the primary and authoritative source for the people who are doing the assessments. And then they go on to say that when any entity, not agencies, any entity assesses compliance with the requirements in 171, you have to use 171A to evaluate their effectiveness. So if you go into 171 and you Control F for 171A, you will see the relationship. If you go into 171A and you do the opposite, you will see the relationship. If you go to the DoD assessment or DoD Procurement Toolbox and you Control F for 171A, you will see the description of how it works. If you go to ISU and you look for 171A, it becomes very apparent that it is the key piece that is missing in the middle of what's going on. Now, I'm hammering this point home and repeating it quite often because of all of the companies that I have worked with, of all of the people that we have taught these ideas to, of all the webinars that we've done, of all the casual conversations with people in the environment from all walks of, making money off the environment, being, having to comply with the environment, doesn't matter who it is. Very, very few people are aware of 171A or what it actually means. So what's in it? What's in 171A? Everybody should take a drink of water for this one. So 171A is the set of assessment procedures for each of the requirements. So it is going to dissect the requirements and tell you how to do an assessment. So if you read through 800-171, you get stuff like this. You get a blurb that says, here's a control. Most people hate this because it isn't very descriptive. It's just this blob of an idea. It doesn't tell you anything. It certainly doesn't tell you how to do anything. Now, that was by design in terms of how they wrote these controls, but it's also the fact that the document that describes the controls is not intended to be the document that tells you how to do them. One of those controls is how to assess, so the control is not going to tell you how to assess. Okay, I know there's a lot going on. So within 171A, you will see the same blurb for the control, and then you will see the entire assessment procedure that corresponds to that control. So there are 7 primary elements going on here, and we're going to step through them very slowly, one by one. The first thing is the control ID. So what you'll notice, especially at something like CMMC to 171, the controls, like we talked about earlier, in their own special way are the same. A lot of times what happens is they change the control ID. The control itself is no different, right? 853 to ISO to CIS to 171 to CMMC. A lot of times the controls fundamentally are the exact same thing. There's only so many ways for you to describe configuration management. There's only so many ways for you to describe access control, right? So the control IDs often change, even though the content of the control does not. The blurb that we're used to seeing in 800-171 is called a control statement. So the best way to describe this is, with a metaphor. So if you look at 800-171 and you only see a collection of control statements and you never look at 800-171A to see the corresponding assessment procedures, that would be like reading the table of contents for a textbook and then walking into the final exam having never read the book, right? Except here, if we don't pass the exam, then we don't get contracts. So read the book. The book is 800-171A. The other half of the model, because it's 2 documents, is 171A, but what to do is documented in the one that nobody knows about. It's the one that they don't even talk about. They always say 171, 171, 171. The interesting thing about what's going on here is that not only is it, it's not perfect, but it gives you more details about what they're talking about in these control statements. But these are the questions that you are going to be asked in an assessment. Remember, this is how any entity will assess you. So when an assessor, CMMC, DIBCAC, somebody else shows up, those are the questions they're going to ask. So all of the mystery around what this is going to look like on assessment day is not a mystery. These are the questions on the test, right? But we only ever read the table of contents. So in the middle here is something known as an assessment objective. Now, every control statement has a corresponding assessment objective. So is anybody in here old enough to remember a sentence diagram in school? Sentence diagramming, right? I'm not old enough. I've just heard about it. Anyways. So a sentence diagram is taking a sentence and breaking out the elements of the sentence. This is the verb, this is the subject, so on and so forth. So if you imagine this tree diagram of a sentence in your mind, of the elements of the sentence, once you label the sentence, have you added anything to the sentence? We're not going to get too existential on anybody here, right? You haven't added anything to the sentence. You are pointing out what the sentence contains. So an assessment objective is the mere version of a control statement, and it consists of some number of what are known as determination statements. Now, the best metaphor here is that this is the sentence diagram according to the people who wrote the control statement. So if you want to know what you need in order to meet this nebulous blob of a control that we don't understand. This is their sentence diagram. So does it sound like it added anything new? Sometimes it does, but as far as the intent goes from the architects of the people who wrote the controls, this is not adding anything new. Now, if this is news to you in terms of what you need to do in order to meet the assessment objective, then it will feel new. But when they show up on assessment day, that is not going to be something, they'll be like, what do you mean? This is the only way you could possibly diagram the sentence. This is the only way you could possibly assess these controls. So determination statements have to be satisfied or not satisfied. And every determination statement has to be satisfied in order for the assessment objective to be met. We're going to repeat this multiple times. You cannot meet the assessment objective for a control statement if you have not satisfied all of the determination statements that exist within the assessment objective. Right? If you're missing one of them, it's other than satisfied. If you haven't done a thing, if you don't have a document, if you haven't done something, right? Even if you have 11 of 12, you haven't met the objective, which means you haven't implemented the control. So if you scored yourself and uploaded it to SPRS, if you have a gap assessment, if you're paying for GRC software and it is not tracking whether you've met the determination statements within the assessment objective, then we have a significant problem. Now, we're not going to call anybody out specifically. This is not trying to bully anybody. This is a, like I said, systemic problem across the industrial base, across the state of the industry, in terms of this being a huge knowledge gap. The good news is, as we move forward, most of the things that you need to do are perfectly capable of meeting these determination statements. But if you wait until assessment day to determine whether you've met them, right, it's not going to go well. So as a collective ecosystem, regardless of what role you play, watchdog, participant, whatever, right, we all need to turn our sort of collective attention away from the fact that things exist to how they relate and what they actually mean when you do them, right? This is what things will look like on assessment day. We're 2 years past webinars that say there's 5 levels and there's 110 controls, right? We're all past that now. Within determination statements, and this gets much more complicated on the 853 side. If you'd like to talk about how that works, then find me after. It's a very fun conversation. But there are these ideas called organizationally defined values, right? These are things that the actual business, the actual organization seeking certification, that you define, right? Remember our internal assessment requirement under NIST 800-171 says that we have to periodically do our own assessment. Who defines the period? You do. It's an organizationally defined value. The government's not going to tell you, right? If the government said you have to do a control assessment every 6 months, when they show up, that's an audit, right? Make sure you're meeting the standard. Here, we're doing an assessment, right? We get to blur these ideas here because you're defining when the period is. Now, this gets a little confusing because remember, you get to define the values within the determination statements, but every determination statement has to be satisfied. So how do you satisfy a determination statement? The way you do that is with what are known as assessment methods. There's only 3. You can examine things, you can interview people, or you can test things. And what is it that you're applying these test methods to, or these assessment methods to? What are known as assessment objects. And these are these blurbs of items or people or processes within every control. And these are not exhaustive lists. These are common items that would come up. These are not designed to be things that are all required. These are just examples that the architects of the document gave you to know what kinds of methods you may or may not apply to what kinds of objects in order to make a determination some number of times to meet the objective of a requirement. So we're not going to go into detail about what these different assessment objects are. Luckily for you, Mr. Bonner in the back is going to get up after a short break, and he's going to go into more detail about what some of these means and how to actually do it. So, get ready. But just very basically, the way that you would roughly categorize these assessment objects is only 4 ways. There's only, with all these blurbs of documents and people in this humongous 800-170A document, there's only 4 categories of objects that could really actually exist. There are specifications that we might examine, probably specifications that we would write or document. Maybe you bought templates for your specifications. There are activities that you conduct, like awareness and training or internal self-assessments. How often you do that is probably something that you define, right? There are individuals who have responsibilities that actually do things like write specifications, do activities, or implement and maintain and operate mechanisms, which is the 4th category. So these would be the software and hardware protections. These would be the actual technology that you have, the actual mechanisms that we could test, the documents that we could examine, the activities that we could observe, the people that we could interview who have the responsibilities for those things. Now, later on in December, we're going to have another webinar, I think specific for Summit 7, that goes into some of the details about individuals and their responsibilities and how that is a useful lens for analyzing this process. You know, Mr. Bonner's going to get up here and he's going to talk about how a useful lens for analyzing this is technical versus non-technical mechanisms and specifications. There's multiple ways to chop this up. There is no one prescriptive way. The big point is you should pick a way, right? Or find someone who is confident in a way and begin interpreting what's going on here because it is critical to success under an assessment. Okay, very quickly. Under assessment methods, there are what they call 2 attributes, depth and coverage. Depth is how much rigor or detail you are going to apply to the method that you have selected when you go to evaluate an assessment object. How close am I going to read your policy, right? How close am I going to examine your specification? The other one is coverage, right? There's lots of different policies that you could have. There's lots of different people with responsibilities that could be applied. How large of a sample size am I going to ask for? How big of a net am I going to throw? How much am I going to cover? So these 2 attributes of your test method is what determines how rigorous your assessment is, right? In the DoD assessment methodology, basic, medium, and high have nothing to do with depth and coverage, right? Basic, medium, and high means something different. Now, this is some feedback to the DoD. I would encourage everyone to send a friendly letter, right? What we want to know is, what are your requirements? What is your desire when an assessor shows up, whether they're paid by the government, they're private, C3PAO, who knows what? When they show up, what is an acceptable minimum level of depth and coverage? One piece of evidence, right? Is it purely situational, which is probably what the answer is, right? But we don't know. We don't know because there haven't been enough people who have asked the question, because there haven't been enough people who know that 171A exists and how these processes all work together. Now, under the idea of depth and coverage, like I said, they don't have basic, medium, and high. They have the idea of basic, focused, and comprehensive. So if you dive into 171A, if you dive into 53A, there are longer explanations of what basic, focused, and comprehensive means in terms of rigor and in terms of how many samples or how large of a sample you're going to pick. So when we describe 171A, we said that it's a document that contains assessment procedures. You have these 7 elements here. All together, all 7 elements all together consist of an assessment procedure, right? You apply assessment methods with some level of depth and coverage to assessment objects that come in certain categories, to make certain determinations, to satisfy an objective, to implement a control. That entire process is an assessment procedure. Okay, like we said, there are elements within these documents, check in time, there are elements within these documents that are up for debate, and there are elements for these documents that are not up for debate. One of the first things that you'll see, if anybody's reading along at home, is that when you read 53A or you read 171A, they'll tell you these are flexible procedures that are designed to be cost effective, right? What do they mean it's flexible? You cannot satisfy a control objective if you don't meet all of the determination statements. That's not flexible. That's very inflexible. So where's the flexibility? The flexibility comes from which assessment methods or combination of assessment methods will you use across which assessment objects at which level of depth and coverage. Now, when you do your internal assessment, it's up to you. When somebody else does an assessment, it's up to them, right? So when they say flexible and cost-effective, like I said, all of the determination statements have to be met in order for the control to be implemented. And just to verify, I emailed DoD CIO, and I said, okay, theoretically, what would happen if I did a self-assessment with 171A the way you told me to, but I didn't meet one of the assessment objectives? And they said, that's not how that works, right? You have an assessment objective that's broken down into determination statements. I know this is very small, so it'll be on the slides, but they said the assessment objective for a particular security requirement is typically made up of several determination statements, which we've already covered, which relate to specific elements of the requirement. They say, if upon assessment, any of those determination statements are not met, this results in a finding of other than satisfied. And accordingly, the overall security requirement would be assessed as other than satisfied until the issue is addressed by the organization, and per NIST SP 800-171 DoD Assessment Methodology, the relevant points would be deducted from your overall score of 110. So we can prove that this is true. We have an email from DoD CIO, right? We've got this crazy document with all these diagrams and highlighted cells and things in there. So if you go to Project Spectrum, the thing that the DoD has been talking about for 3 years as their solution for teaching you how to understand the requirements, for teaching you how to go about implementing things. Full disclosure, I have no affiliation with Project Spectrum. I'm sure they're very nice people. Project Spectrum is not a very robust resource for taking you from zero to fully implemented. One of the tools, though, that they do have, I mean, the stuff they have on there is pretty good, but very basic, right? It's like the stuff that we needed 2 or 3 years ago about awareness of these things. That's still where a lot of the Project Spectrum content is. But they have a self-assessment tool. We've all seen these self-assessment tools. We've seen spreadsheets. We've seen free tools. We've seen GRC vendors, very nice, friendly people at the GRC vendors, who will say, we can run you through a self-assessment that can document what you need in order to calculate your SPRS score and use that as a proxy for your readiness to your customers or to the government or to yourself. So when you look at Project Spectrum's version, what do we have? Control ID. Like we said, those change all the time, right? We can change that, we can call it whatever we want to. We have a control statement, which is identical to what's in 171, I would hope, because this is the 171 assessment within Project Spectrum. And then we have determination statements. Now, they're not labeled the same as what's in 171A, but word for word, those are the determination statements for this control. Now, they say over here, yes, no, answer later, not sure. What's not on this self-assessment tool? There's no assessment objects, right? There's no assessment methods. There's no setting for depth and coverage. None of that is obvious if you were to go look at this tool and say, okay, I'm going to make a determination about this assessment objective. You would have no idea. You just read through it and you go, yep, 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 no, 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 yep, yep, yep. So I did a little experiment. If you walk through and you look at all of the determination statements for all 110 controls in the Project Spectrum tool, and this is, like I said, this is not picking on the Project Spectrum tool. This is an example because I asked DoD officially, is this reasoning correct? If I'm missing even one assessment objective for a control, I remove those points, right? And they said, yeah. So I picked a 5-point control. Ironically, it's our favorite one. Our internal assessment, periodically assess your controls for implementation. It's worth 5 points. And I said, okay, there's only 2 determination statements for that one. There's, sometimes there's 1, sometimes there's 12. There's 2 determination statements. I'll pick every other determination statement for every other control in 171A, and I'll say, yep, I do that, but I'm missing 1 of the 2 for a 5-point control. Guess what happened? Anybody? What would my score be? So when I said there is a systemic problem when we talk about how we assess ourselves, right? When we pay vendors, whenever we talk about what's going on in terms of how the controls interact, there is a significant problem in terms of the overall understanding of how you would calculate a score that is honestly sort of perpetuated by the design decisions of government documentation. I mean, this is not to beat up on anybody, in industry. They are not making this easy. I mean, you saw the map. The map looks crazy. You've seen the timeline talk. I had to spend a significant period of time just trying to untangle what it was they were talking about. But if you didn't do that, watch the talk. If you didn't do that and you just walk in to do your self-assessment, then you're going to score yourself incorrectly. And if you are using that incorrect score, because they're not checking, it's basic self-assessment, right? You uploaded it to SPRS, they're not checking. You might never get a medium or high. CMMC might turn out to be what people really say it is. And they're gonna show up and assess you, and if you don't make it, you don't make it. If you use that score that was incorrect as a proxy to yourself for your level of readiness in an assessment, you won't make it. But we know what questions they're going to ask. Like we said, wrapping up here, 800-171 to 800-171 to CMMC, same controls, right? There's more details, but they're the same controls. 800-171 to 800-171A, same document. The CMMC assessment guide, which is on the CMMC model page, just like 171A is on the model page, right? Same assessment procedures, same controls. The only things that have changed are the control IDs, some of the styling, some of the descriptions, the explanations, same process. So whether you are a believer in CMMC, whether you are a hater of CMMC, doesn't matter, right? If you believe that 171 is real, which it's very real, then the process will apply regardless of whether the CMMC program exists, whether we call it something different, who's getting paid to come assess us, it doesn't matter, right? It's the same fundamentals. So there are 320 determination statements in 800-171A, not 110. There are 110 controls, 320 things. So it's a very simplistic and sort of reductionist way of thinking about security. It is not probably the best way of thinking about security, but we're starting at square one here, right? We're not working off of the assumption that everybody has a security program. We're not working off the assumption that everybody is bought into this idea and has budget and people and resources and. All of the things that we trash the government for incorrectly assuming, right? We don't want to then turn around and poo-poo this idea because it's bad. It is a useful way of analyzing your understanding of the environment. It is a useful way of understanding how you measure up to the requirements, and it is consistent. And so on here, right, some number and then DS for determination statement. This will be in the slides. If you take the 110 controls, you divide them across families, right? Some families have more controls, some have less. What's ironic is that some families that have very few controls have numerous numbers of determination statements. There's a lot of work to be done. I would encourage industry to deconflict, deduplicate, synthesize the objective evidence, the methods, the descriptions. We need many more technical writers to take this out of the minds of the very smart folks at NIST and translate it into normal human words so that it doesn't take somebody having to spend 2 years, drawing red lines all over their office to try to get up and explain the most basic idea of how to know if a control is even implemented. So key takeaways. The single best thing that you can do if you don't know what to do when you are talking to anyone, including yourself if you're at home, about whether you know what's going on, whether they know what's going on, whether you're ready, is to say, how do you measure up against the assessment objectives? Not how do you measure up against 171? That's the table of contents. How do you measure up against the index, right? If they can't answer the question, encourage them to answer the question and then go from there. So if you did not use the assessment objectives and determination statements in your gap assessments, in your system security plan creation, in your SPRS score calculation, then you need to revisit your math. And that's why we called the talk fuzzy math, because we said, yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Okay, self-assessment tools or GRC software that helps to facilitate your compliance has to address the assessment objectives. If you fire up a demo, there's a lot of friendly people on LinkedIn who will offer you demos. The first question, where are the assessment objectives? Right? If it's not in there yet, then wait for the next version. So be very wary of sales sheets, one-pagers, descriptions of services, whether they are from the government, whether they are from private industry, that say, our solution maps to this control. We've all seen this, right? We've all seen people that say, our solution will get you to 110. Our solution will get you too close to 110. Our solution maps to one control, and the assessment objectives are not listed. How do you know? How do you know? You know by going through the determination statements in the objective. We already know what questions to ask. So just ask those questions. This is a way of turning the tables of the industry against vendors and government bureaucrats who can't be bothered to explain what they want us to do, right? Ask the questions that they will ask you, and then you are now on the same page. Okay, just wrapping up. There are two parts to 171. There are two parts to 853. There are two parts to CMMC, right? There is an assessment guide for each of those models. Any control framework that does not have a corresponding assessment guide or a corresponding document that gives you assessment procedures is only half of a model. This is a hill that I will die on. As a recovering cybersecurity engineer, we have a lot of cybersecurity engineers. We don't have a lot of engineering rigor in the cybersecurity field. A lot of people love the NIST CSF. It is very good because it takes that big blob of stuff and categorizes it into things that we can better understand. But it does not give you an assessment guide. So if you're using the NIST CSF for your program and you don't have a set of test procedures, how do you know? CIS, great controls, right? Wonderful controls. It's much easier to read, much easier to understand, right? If you don't have the assessment guide, then you have to go through the process of decomposing the requirements, coming up with methods, doing all this stuff, analyzing evidence, making determinations. Not impossible to do, but they didn't give you the guide. If you only took the 171 half, right, the table of contents half, you don't have any assurance, or someone assessing you doesn't have any assurance that you did it properly.